German panzer divisions were racing ahead of their supply lines before they reached Warsaw. September 1939. 47 panzer tanks are reportedly idling outside Warsaw with empty gauges and no supply line. The radio man's hand is shaking because he knows what happens when 200 men become stationary targets in enemy territory. The battalion commander knows it too. But according to unit records, he's ordering the engines started anyway. This isn't courage. It's the founding lie of the Third Reich. Because what the mechanics discovered at that fuel depot wasn't more gasoline. It was a technique that would let them advance 400 kilometers on vapor and prayer, a trick that would define every German offensive for the next 6 years. The kind of trick that works brilliantly until it doesn't. This gamble will either reach Warsaw by dawn or turn the battalion into a mass grave by noon. But here's what makes this moment the skeleton key to the entire war. Every German commander, from Poland to Stalingrad, will face this exact choice. Advance beyond your logistics, or admit the Reich can't sustain what it started. The engines are turning over. The math says they should be silent. And the men inside those tanks are about to learn that Blitzkrieg was never a strategy. It was a beautiful, suicidal bluff that Germany would ride until the fuel ran out for good. The plan is encirclement, at tempo, faster than the enemy can react. Bypass strong points, let infantry mop up, and keep the armor moving. Weber's battalion punches through Polish defenses at 30 kilometers per hour, faster than Polish cavalry can reposition, and faster than their own supply officers predicted. By nightfall, the tanks halt in a captured village. According to unit records, fuel trucks typically arrived within hours, carrying gasoline to refill the tanks and prepare for the next morning's advance. The war feels like a tightly choreographed logistics exercise with a ticking clock. If the fuel arrives, the offensive works. If it does not, the entire battalion becomes immobile, and the enemy escapes encirclement. For now, the fuel arrives. May 1940. Weber's battalion punches through the Ardennes forest into France, threading narrow roads the French High Command assumed were impassable for armor. French and British forces retreat faster than the panzers can pursue. The fuel constraint is still present. Each tank still burns through its 320-liter load in half a day. But the enemy collapses so quickly that supply trucks catch up each evening before the tanks can go dry. The Wehrmacht captures more fuel depots than it consumes. For 6 weeks, the war is a pursuit operation, not a battle. Officers begin to believe the model is sustainable, that speed and shock can substitute for logistics depth. The mathematics have not changed, but the enemy's will to fight has, and that makes all the difference. By the fall of France, Blitzkrieg is no longer experimental. It is doctrine. Rapid maneuver, combined arms coordination, fuel arriving just in time. Frontline commanders have internalized the operational rhythm. Advance one fuel load, halt, refuel, repeat. The system works because the campaigns are short, the roads are paved, and the distances are manageable. No one is yet asking what happens when the roads turn to mud, when the enemy refuses to collapse, or when supply columns must travel 400 kilometers instead of 200. The Panzer III still holds 320 liters. The fuel trucks still move at the same speed. But the assumptions built on top of those numbers are about to meet a front that will stretch nearly 3,000 kilometers into a country where paved roads are scarce. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa begins. Weber's battalion receives orders to advance 400 kilometers in the first week, a pace significantly faster and deeper than prior campaigns. The panzers roll east into the Soviet Union on roads that are not roads, but dirt tracks that turn to soup when it rains. Supply columns follow on the same tracks, moving at 15 kilometers per hour instead of the 30 they managed on French highways. A 200-kilometer gap now takes supply trucks 13 hours to close instead of 7, and the gap is widening every day because the front keeps moving. The fuel still arrives, but the margin is shrinking. Regulation reserves are often ignored, with tanks reportedly halting with as little as 40 liters left instead of the prescribed 80. Officers begin rationing fuel for reconnaissance, saving every liter for the next leap forward. German supply trucks grind to a halt at the railhead. Engineers stare at the captured Soviet tracks. They try to roll a German locomotive forward. The wheels don't fit. They clunk, scrape, refuse to grip. The entire Soviet rail network is useless to them. The problem is in the rails themselves. Soviet railways run on broad-gauge track, 1,520 millimeters wide. German standard gauge is 1,435 millimeters. The difference is 85 millimeters, roughly the width of a human hand. That hand-width gap means no German locomotive or railcar can run on captured Soviet track without physically re-spiking every meter of rail. Engineer battalions work around the clock re-gauging captured lines. A typical crew can convert only 2 to 3 kilometers per day. But the front requires 30 supply trains daily to sustain operations across a 600-kilometer sector. That requires at least 600 kilometers of converted track. The math is simple and unforgiving. At 3 kilometers per day per crew, the front advances faster than the rail can be converted. Every kilometer east increases the gap that supply trucks must cover by road. Winter 1942. Representing the experience of Luftwaffe ground crews, accounts describe mechanics like Obergefreiter Hans Klug, stationed at supply airfields outside the Stalingrad pocket. Temperatures drop to minus 30 Celsius at night. Aircraft engine oil becomes semi-solid in the cold. Starter motors cannot turn the crankshaft unless the engine is preheated to at least minus 20 degrees. The airfield has 6 functioning heating units for 40 aircraft. Each plane requires 30 to 45 minutes of external heat before the engine will start. Klug and his crew can preheat 6 aircraft per cycle. A full sortie launch requires 6 or 7 cycles, totaling 5 to 6 hours. But the airlift window is dictated by Soviet air patrols and daylight, leaving only 90 minutes of safe operation each morning. Every aircraft that sits cold on the apron means another 20 wounded soldiers remain trapped in the pocket overnight. The daily arithmetic of insufficiency is unforgiving. 6 engines can be heated in 45 minutes. That means 12 aircraft airborne in 90 minutes if everything works perfectly and no heating unit fails. The remaining 28 planes sit idle. The wounded soldiers waiting on stretchers inside the pocket need 40 flights per day to evacuate critical cases. Only 12 can be delivered. The other 28 flights do not happen. There is no workaround, no clever logistics trick, no operational tempo that can solve the fact that 6 heating units cannot preheat 40 aircraft in 90 minutes. The math is fixed. The soldiers stay in the pocket. Those responsible for these operations understood this reality every morning when the first heating hose was connected. They also knew that stopping was not an option, so the preheating continued, 6 planes at a time. Late 1941. In a scenario typical of Operation Typhoon, a German battalion receives orders to seize a rail junction 40 kilometers ahead. The tanks have enough fuel to reach the objective, but not enough to maneuver once they arrive, or to withdraw if the attack fails. The battalion commander radios division requesting a resupply schedule before the advance. Division reports that fuel trucks are stuck in mud 150 kilometers west and will not arrive for at least 18 hours. The order to attack stands. The battalion advances and halts 40 kilometers forward with empty tanks, unable to move, unable to retreat. Soviet artillery begins ranging shots within 3 hours. Historical accounts from similar units describe heavy losses over the following days. Tanks destroyed by artillery fire while completely immobilized, unable to move a single meter. The rail junction remains in Soviet hands. When fuel trucks finally arrive days later, the offensive is over. 1943. According to wartime accounts, Hauptmann Ernst Becker commands a pioneer battalion tasked with getting Tiger tanks across a major river to support a bridgehead on the eastern bank. Standard Wehrmacht pontoon bridges support 16 tons maximum. Each Tiger weighs 57 tons. The engineers reportedly calculate that a specialized solution is needed: reinforced concrete piers that transfer the load directly to the riverbed. Under optimal conditions with rapid hardening agents, concrete could reach substantial strength within 48 hours. Moving a Tiger before that risks pier collapse and losing a 57-ton tank into the river. Soviet reconnaissance has already spotted the construction. If the heavy armor cannot cross before Soviet reinforcements arrive, the bridgehead collapses, and estimates suggest several thousand troops, potentially up to 4,000, could be cut off on the eastern bank. Becker has 48 hours. The Soviets are believed to be 30 kilometers away and closing. March 1945. In the Courland pocket, a shrinking German enclave on the Baltic coast cut off from the rest of the front, battalion commanders face impossible communications challenges. The standard Tornister Empfänger radio has a maximum range of 5 kilometers in open terrain, less in forests. With division headquarters typically 12 kilometers away across Soviet-held ground, with hills and dense pine forest in between, many officers receive no orders for withdrawal, no artillery support coordinates, and no contact with neighboring units for 36 hours or more. Soviet forces probe the perimeter constantly. Without knowing if division is ordering a retreat, a counterattack, or a static defense, and without coordination, any movement risks friendly fire or encirclement. These battalions are operationally blind, and their radios will not reach far enough to fix it. Historical technical data indicates that a Panzer III moving cross-country at combat speeds consumed fuel at a significantly higher rate than often assumed, likely exceeding 60 to 70 liters per hour in actual field conditions. With a 320-liter fuel capacity, that provides approximately 4 to 5 hours of operation before the tank is immobile. At an average cross-country speed of 20 kilometers per hour, technical manuals suggest a maximum range of roughly 95 to 100 kilometers, though road conditions could extend this somewhat. Supply columns traveling on unpaved roads move at 15 kilometers per hour and require 10 to 15 hours to close a 200-kilometer gap. Any advance beyond one fuel load creates a 24-hour vulnerability window in which the battalion has no mobility, no ability to maneuver, and no option to withdraw. If the supply column is delayed by weather, enemy action, or mechanical breakdown, that window extends indefinitely. The tank becomes a stationary pillbox until fuel arrives or the crew abandons it. Every meter of captured Soviet track must be physically respiked to narrow the gauge by 85 millimeters, from the Soviet standard of 1,520 millimeters down to the German standard of 1,435. Or every cargo load must be transshipped by hand from one rail car to another at the gauge transition point. A conversion crew equipped with jacks, sledgehammers, and spike pullers can regauge 2 to 3 kilometers of track per day under ideal conditions. Do the math. A front requiring 30 supply trains daily needs at least 600 kilometers of converted rail from the German border to the forward depots. At 3 kilometers per day per crew, that's 200 crew days. Even with 10 crews working in parallel, you're looking at 20 days of continuous work. But the front advances 30 to 40 kilometers per day in the opening weeks of Barbarossa, outpacing rail conversion by a factor of 10. The result? Mountains of supplies rotting at the gauge change stations, ammunition crates stacked in open air, fuel, drums rusting, food spoiling. Everything the front needs stranded hundreds of kilometers behind the advance because the rails can't keep pace with the Panzers. Aircraft engine oil viscosity increases exponentially as temperature drops below 0 Celsius. At minus 30 degrees, lubricating oil becomes nearly solid, and starter motors cannot generate enough torque to turn the crankshaft. Preheating the engine to -20 degrees restores oil flow and allows ignition. External heating units pump hot air into the engine cowling for 30 to 45 minutes per aircraft. With 6 heating units and 40 aircraft requiring launch, a mechanic must cycle through 6 planes at a time. 6 cycles of 45 minutes each totals 4.5 hours to preheat 36 aircraft. The remaining 4 require another cycle. Airlift windows at Stalingrad are limited to 90 minutes of relative safety from Soviet fighters, determined by dawn timing and cloud cover. 4.5 hours of preparation cannot fit into a 90-minute operational window, so most aircraft never leave the ground. A pontoon bridge distributes load across multiple floating sections. Each pontoon float supports roughly 2 to 3 tons before submerging. A 16-ton vehicle requires 6 to 8 floats assembled in series. But a 57-ton Tiger tank? At least 20 floats, impractical to assemble quickly under fire. The alternative? A reinforced concrete pier that transfers the vehicle's weight directly to the riverbed rather than relying on buoyancy. But concrete doesn't harden on command. With rapid hardening additives and ideal conditions, engineers estimated concrete could reach significant strength within 48 hours, though standard field mixes took far longer. Try to move a 57-ton load across that pier prematurely, and you hear it, the sharp crack of shear failure in the concrete. The structure collapses. The tank sinks into the river. Engineers can accelerate curing slightly with heat or chemical additives. Slightly. Not enough to compress days into hours. Not enough to save a bridgehead when the enemy is already closing in. German portable radio equipment of the period operated under significant technical constraints. VHF signals, like those used by transceivers such as the Tornister Funkgerät, travel in straight lines and cannot bend around terrain or penetrate dense foliage effectively. For standard man-pack transceivers, effective range in open terrain could reach roughly 8 kilometers in telegraphy mode, though voice communication was typically more limited. Forest canopy and hills reduced operational range considerably, often to 5 kilometers or less. At 12 kilometers with intervening ridges and pine forest, signal strength would drop below minimum threshold, and communication would become impossible. Relay stations could extend range by receiving and retransmitting signals, but each relay required a manned position with a functioning radio, time to establish, and secure ground to operate. In a fluid or encircled situation like Courland in 1945, relay positions were often overrun or out of right. Contact themselves. The only solution was to physically move closer to headquarters or wait until headquarters moved closer, neither of which an encircled battalion commander could control. December 1941. Weber receives orders from division to resume the offensive toward Moscow. His battalion has 80 liters of fuel per tank, roughly 3 hours of operation, and no resupply schedule. He radios division reporting that the attack is mechanically impossible and requests clarification. Division replies that the order stands and that fuel will be provided as available. Weber understands what this means. Division does not have fuel to send and is passing the impossible decision down to him. He can order the attack, advance 60 kilometers, and watch his tanks run dry in open ground. Or he can refuse the order and face court-martial. There is no tactical solution. The fuel does not exist. Weber orders the battalion to prepare for the attack and then halts them before they leave the assembly area, citing mechanical failures. Division does not follow up. The offensive dies quietly. January 1943. In Alexander Kluge's documentary account of the Stalingrad airlift, a scene unfolds at the airfield. 2 Ju-52 transports lift off with engines running smoothly after 4 hours of preheating. 6 aircraft sit behind them with cold engines and no heating units available. 28 wounded soldiers lie on stretchers in a dugout next to the runway, waiting for the next sortie. Soviet fighters are expected within 30 minutes, which means no more flights today. The account depicts the brutal mathematics of the airlift. 2 aircraft preheated when the mission required 12. The calculation has been done 100 times. 6 heating units cannot preheat 40 planes in 90 minutes. There is no way to make the numbers work. The wounded soldiers will wait another day. Some of them will not survive the wait. The heating hoses are disconnected, and the cycle begins again for tomorrow, knowing the outcome will be the same. Summer 1943. According to German unit records, pioneer troops have poured concrete footings for a Dnieper bridge. The concrete has cured for only 18 hours, roughly 40% of design strength. Then, Soviet artillery begins ranging shots, each impact closer than the last. Reconnaissance reports enemy reinforcements 6 hours away. Division orders the crossing to proceed immediately. A test vehicle crosses the pier, a half-loaded supply truck weighing roughly 12 tons. The concrete shows visible cracking under load. Engineers estimate the pier will support perhaps 30 tons before catastrophic failure. A Tiger weighs 57 tons. The artillery is walking closer. The officer radios division that crossing now will result in loss of the tanks into the river. Division replies that the bridgehead must be reinforced or thousands of troops will be lost. The shells are landing every 30 seconds now. The order is given. The Tigers remain on the west bank. Historical accounts suggest the bridgehead collapsed 6 hours later. The Tigers never crossed. March 1945. Richter's battalion begins an unsynchronized withdrawal from the Courland pocket because he has no radio contact with division or neighboring units, and Soviet forces are overrunning his flanks. 2 hours into the retreat, German artillery, reportedly from a unit approximately 15 kilometers west, begins firing on his column, mistaking the movement for a Soviet advance. Richter has no way to signal the artillery battery because his radio cannot reach that far, and no relay stations are functioning. According to accounts from the Courland pocket, such friendly fire incidents claimed numerous casualties before couriers could reach artillery batteries and stop the fire. The withdrawal continues in chaos. Richter reaches friendly lines 12 hours later, with half his battalion missing, some captured, some killed by friendly fire, some scattered in the forest with no communication. The radio sat silent the entire time. By February 1942, Army Group Center's offensive toward Moscow has stalled. Entire panzer divisions sit immobile for weeks. Tanks are dug in as stationary artillery. Infantry divisions ration rifle ammunition. Why? Supply columns cannot close the 300-kilometer gap from the railheads. The front stabilizes roughly 200 kilometers short of Moscow. Empty fuel drums. Silent engines. The Blitzkrieg has ended not with a battle, but with machines that cannot move. Officers at the front recognize the war is unwinnable at this moment, 2.5 years before Berlin falls. The arithmetic cannot be reversed. Every kilometer east makes resupply harder. Retreat is politically impossible. Advance is mechanically impossible. And the cause? German accounts emphasize fuel and ammunition exhaustion above all else. The Wehrmacht could not move. Yet the massive Soviet counteroffensive that began in December was equally decisive. Logistics strangled the advance, but the Red Army delivered the final blow. The Stalingrad airlift was intended to supply 300,000 encircled troops with food, ammunition, and fuel by air. It required roughly 300 tons of cargo delivered daily. The Luftwaffe managed an average of 95 tons per day, less than 1/3 of the requirement, because of aircraft mechanical failures, fuel shortages, Soviet air interdiction, and the cold start heating problem that kept most planes grounded. Over the course of the airlift, the Luftwaffe lost more than 500 transport aircraft and their crews. The 6th Army surrendered in February 1943 with 91,000 survivors out of 250,000 originally encircled. The airlift did not fail because of lack of courage or effort. It failed because the heating units, fuel supplies, and aircraft availability could not overcome the thermodynamic and logistical constraints that German commanders confronted on the frozen airfields of the Southern Front. In one account from the Dnieper campaign, a German commander's decision to keep Tigers on the West Bank proved mechanically sound, but operationally devastating. Without heavy armor support, the bridgehead could not hold against Soviet counterattack. Pioneer troops evacuated under fire, reportedly leaving 12 Tigers on the west bank, and roughly 3,000 infantry cut off on the east bank with no route to withdraw. Most were killed or captured within 48 hours. The Tigers eventually crossed at a different location approximately 2 weeks later, using a purpose-built heavy bridge. But by then, the operational moment was gone and the front had shifted. According to this account, the bridgehead failure was not due to tactical error or enemy superiority. It stemmed from the technical constraints of bridge construction, requiring extended preparation time, and the Reich's strategic timeline demanding immediate action. The two could not be reconciled. The Courland pocket remained isolated until May 1945, weeks after Berlin fell. According to available records, communication failures and lack of coordination led to disorganized retreats and instances of friendly fire during the final collapse. Unit-level reports, such as those from Friedrich Wilhelm Richter's command, suggest that many battalions operated without orders for days at a time, making decisions based on local information and often contradicting the movements of adjacent units they could not contact. The radio range problems documented in March reportedly continued until the final surrender. Roughly 200,000 German troops were trapped in Courland at the end of the war. Most became prisoners. The pocket was a microcosm of the Wehrmacht's collapse. Capable soldiers, functioning weapons, and no ability to coordinate action because the communication systems could not bridge the distances or terrain. Empty fuel gauges outside Warsaw. Outside Moscow. 2 winters. 2 failures. After the war, US and Soviet military academies tore apart every Wehrmacht operation, searching for the answer. What they found was unanimous. Logistical capacity determines operational possibility. No amount of tactical skill or technological superiority can overcome supply failure. The lesson wasn't about morality, it was about mechanical reality. Modern commanders still study these fuel crises. U.S. Army Staff College curricula cite Operation Barbarossa and the Wehrmacht's fuel exhaustion outside Moscow as the reference case for what happens when operational tempo exceeds supply throughput. NATO standards now mandate logistics planning before operational planning. Ground forces are required to maintain fuel and ammunition reserves sufficient for 7 days of high-intensity combat before launching offensive operations. The specific example they're taught? German Panzers. 1939, 1941. Empty tanks in the snow. The foundational case of what not to do. The operational innovations pioneered by the Wehrmacht, combined arms coordination, radio-enabled maneuver warfare, and close air-ground integration, survived the war and became foundational to modern mechanized warfare. Every contemporary army uses some variation of the tactics developed during the Blitzkrieg campaigns. But those tactics are now explicitly paired with the logistical lesson that the Wehrmacht learned too late. The U.S. Army's air-land battle doctrine, developed in the 1980s, combined rapid maneuver with pre-positioned supply depots and improved logistical synchronization, with more comprehensive just-in-time logistics networks emerging in subsequent decades, designed to prevent exactly the kind of supply collapse that immobilized the Wehrmacht's tanks. The Soviet deep battle doctrine incorporated similar principles. The tactics work, but only when logistics can sustain them. That understanding, paid for with hundreds of thousands of immobilized vehicles and encircled divisions, is the Wehrmacht's legacy to modern warfare. The German war machine ran out of fuel before it conquered its first city. That sentence is not hyperbole. It is mechanical fact. Weber's tanks idled outside Warsaw with empty gauges in September 1939, and they idled outside Moscow with empty gauges in December 1941. The interval between those two moments was filled with brilliant tactical victories and operational innovation, but the underlying constraint never changed. The Panzer III held 320 liters. The supply trucks moved at 15 kilometers per hour on bad roads. The Soviet rail gauge was 85 millimeters too wide. The heating units could preheat 6 engines at a time. The concrete needed 48 hours to cure. The radios reached 5 kilometers. Those numbers did not bend to ambition or ideology. They defined what was possible, and the Wehrmacht exceeded them for 2 years before the system collapsed. The soldiers knew. The fuel gauges were always empty. The war was over before it started.